This is the Aiwa AD-F660. My thoughts and impressions on this 3-head, 2-motor, vintage of the 1980s cassette deck. The peak level meters have 3 colors: green, yellow, and red. They tell you quite a bit. They are going to be a peak variety, but they're not a peak hold. In other words, it's not going to hold for a second or two the highest reading that it's going to get from the signal, unlike some of the cassette decks that I own. Does this make this very hard to set the levels? Not really, because you do have green, yellow, and red to warn you of possible distortion and tape saturation. Now they do have markers here for normal, chrome equivalent, and metal tape to inform you of what the ideal record level is and how you should not really exceed that. I've kind of experimented using these particular marks, and sometimes on normal bias tape I could actually get away with recording a lot hotter into the chrome or even the metal side. So a little experimentation and monitoring really helps a lot. The meters, I would say, I would give them an average to good, easy to set the levels and monitor your input. Not really super extraordinary, unlike, say, my Techniques or my JVC, which even gives you a numerical value of what the peak is. It's kind of a really nice touch. I have to say that's probably my favorite, but this is definitely, certainly competent in getting the job done. When you remove the top cover on the Aiwa 660, you're going to see quite a bit of wire. If you've never taken apart something from the 70s, the 80s, and even into the early 90s, you're going to be kind of surprised with how much wire there really is compared with what you see today in your more micro kind of electronics kind of thing. All through hole components, linear power supply, and very, very much in the way of discrete components. You might see a few integrated circuits here, some that control the Dolby noise reduction, some that control the transport functions, maybe even some other things that are proprietary to the Aiwa machine. I don't know all of the ins and outs of electronics, but I just wanted to give a shot here to give you an idea of what's really inside this tape machine. The transport's very easy to get to. It's one of those kinds of things where if you have to do belt replacement, it isn't very difficult to get to compared to some of the other machines that I've worked on. So to get to the belts, I would say average to good as far as how you make those changes. This is an excellent shot of the transport taken out of the chassis of the 660. You're going to note the head stack there. This is 3 heads. You're going to see the erase head, the record head, and the playback head. Note that the record head and the playback head are both sandwiched in a common housing. Common practice very much in many cassette decks. I think Nakamichi is one of the very few that actually uses a completely discrete separate housing. But this is a most common practice from a tooling standpoint, and manufacturing probably saves the manufacturer quite a bit in using a sandwich system as opposed to 3 discrete heads. Alignment is probably a little bit easier with this. That I don't know, but it might be. But I typically see more of the sandwich type arrangement than I will see the discrete ones, like I say, on a Nakamichi. You'll also note that the pinch rollers are different size. This is known as an asymmetrical transport drive. It helps cancel unwanted additional resonances that are caused by like masses. Okay, so utilizing different size capstans, different size pinch rollers, help cancel out unwanted resonances or vibrations, if you will. You'll notice also, if you look carefully between the reel tables, another small wheel there. It's a mode idler, and that basically controls the reel that is desired to be turned relative to the mode that's asked of that reel to turn, such as fast forward, play, and rewind, for example. Not too unlike, say, a typical VHS, we still remember those, VHS video recorder systems and playback, of course, that use this reel idler to control or actually come in contact with the various different reel tables relative to the particular mode it's asked to perform. Again, rewind, fast forward, stop, and so on. So this cassette deck could almost be called kind of a small miniaturized VCR of sorts, maybe about 1/10 of the way anyway. Nothing really extraordinary in the construction. It's just stamped steel construction to help maintain the alignment. You'll see the various different levers and actuators here to have the transport perform its various different functions. If you look carefully enough, near the bottom right of this photo, for example, you'll see the actual tape detection devices. Since the top of the cassette usually will have holes put in strategic locations to help facilitate the automatic tape selection without using any of the panel switches in the front for normal chrome equivalent or chromium dioxide tapes or metal tapes. You will note that there is no ferrochrome support here. Ferrochrome being a tape that kind of died a very silent death. Frankly, no love lost there. Going to notice some more wires here, some various different connectors to control the various different portions of the transport. It's a pretty intricate piece of technology right here. Something that I would say that you would not want to really disassemble beyond more than replacing the mode idler wheel or the belts. Probably leave the rest alone because it doesn't look like really a lot of fun to fix. The rear panel is no less interesting than the front panel in that you do have mic to line mixing, if you will. It's a very popular thing in the 1970s especially. Going into the 1980s though, in the 1980s you started to slowly see a fall away of microphone inputs. As a matter of fact, in the 90s it's pretty much gone. So typically line inputs were the order of the day in the 90s. In the 1970s, the 1980s on the other hand, line and mic mixing, very common. You're going to find that there is no facility to control the difference between the line and mic. Both would be pretty much at their same level. So you're probably going to want to record mics first or line level first, because you're probably not going to do very well mixing wise because you can't control the levels because they're not isolated. So that's kind of a miss on Aiwa's part. I think they just said, well, we need mic inputs here, and only they know why that was the case. Frankly, I never used the microphone preamplifiers in any reel-to-reel or cassette deck because they don't tend to be, frankly, very good. And they also won't have enough gain to drive the microphones I use anyway. But everybody's use case is a little bit different. The facility is there in case you do want to experiment. 6.3 millimeter or 1/4 inch. Tip ring sleeve is your typical connection there. The phono connections there, RCA phono connections for the line in as well as the line out, minus 10 dBV and dBu. Standard fare for any audio equipment. This will not support balanced XLR or 1/4 inch. This is not the intended market for this cassette deck. This is a consumer machine, not a broadcast or professional machine. Though if you wanted to, you could integrate this into a studio environment. Many people do. They'll integrate a cassette deck or a reel-to-reel, for example, that may have been for consumer, but they'll put that inside their studio. Many have done it, and they've done it quite successfully. The multiplex filter to, if you will, filter out the 19 kilohertz pilot tones so that way your Dolby noise reduction system does not mistrack. An oddity here is the headphone level. Why Aiwa chose to use a low and high switch, again, only they know. Most folks would have put in a nice volume potentiometer right there so you can have more granularity as far as how loud you want your headphone level to be. Not all headphones are made the same, and I almost will guarantee you the low and the high will never be satisfactory with just virtually about any headphone you plug into it. It's either going to be too low or it's going to be too loud, and you don't have anything that's in between. So that's a miss on Aiwa's part. I would have gladly paid another $10 for a decent potentiometer, maybe in the rear. Ideally, I would have loved to see it in the front, but there's no place to put it, so they decided to put it in the rear. I probably would have said, eliminate the timer function. I really don't need that. Put the volume pot for the headphone in the front in place of that, and I think I'd probably be okay. After that, you're going to find the DIN connector for the remote control function. There are some very interesting fellows and gals out there, maybe a gal doing this, who are using these Dish or DirecTV remote control systems with an IR transceiver that will convert the signals over to the appropriate voltages and logic, if you will, going into this DIN connector on the back of the panel of this Aiwa. I've seen this on a few other cassette decks. So if you can't quite get the original remote, or you just don't feel like paying the ransom demand price for it, you can find these on eBay for around $75 to $80 or so. And this will give you a wireless connection to your Aiwa cassette deck or other brands, because there are other brands these folks take care of, such as Sony and so on. So that is definitely out there. Let's talk a little bit about the feature set that comes with this cassette deck. And I would say, on the whole, I would say it's fairly generous, but not overly so. The mic line mixing is a miss. I would have liked to have seen that. If you're going to put microphones in there, let me have a facility to control that. But there are a lot of cassette decks that are out there that don't offer good line mic mixing capabilities. I think one of the best I've ever seen was the Marantz 5000 series. I believe it might have been the 5420 that did that. It even offered pan pot adjustments there, so you could adjust the image left and right. So that was a pretty nice feature. The other thing that's very nice about this is the tape shuttling, music scan, and such is very handy, as well as the how many minutes are left on your cassette. Maybe you have a particular presentation you're recording, and you just really kind of like to know if this side is going to make it for that particular segment, or at least that entire presentation. So that's a nice feature. The other thing would be legibility. I would say I would give that about an average to good. It's very easy to see most of the displays. The only one is probably a slight miss, and I agree with one reviewer who talked about this. When your cassette deck is in record mode, the only thing that lets you know that's in record mode is that record button that's on the transport. And that's sitting, of course, horizontally. Maybe if the LED was a little bit brighter, that probably wouldn't be a big deal, but maybe an indicator on the actual area where the LED is, the peak display is, that might have been helpful too. As far as the cassette well, that's another thing I love to talk a little bit about, is that a lot of cassette well doors block off quite a bit of the view of cassettes, but some of them are very generous. My JVC is very good. Both my JVCs are very good. The KD85 and my TDV621 is very good. My techniques are very good. My Nakamichi is a little bit stingy. My Akai Diatone is even more so. Kind of really like to see what's really going on with the tape. How much do I have left? Is the well backlit? All of these kinds of things. And thankfully, the Aiwa is. So it is kind of nice to be able to see what's in the tape pack. So definitely, some nice touches. I'm really kind of a fan of the feature set. It's just enough, but it isn't so overwhelming that it's actually silly. There are a couple of machines above this one, the 770 and the 990. The 990, of course, being the flagship, and it's virtually, at this particular point, unobtainium. People know what this is, and they're fighting very hard for it on the bay, if you will. 660 is kind of getting that way as well. It's a rare bear also, but not quite as rare as maybe a 990 is, or a 770 for that matter. But these are very highly sought after machines, and they will go toe to toe with the likes of Nakamichi and so on. Which brings us into the sound, which we'll talk about next. We talked about a lot of the technology. Now, how does this guy sound? The AD-F660. Well, let's start with the bass. The bass is very tight, fairly well extended. I wouldn't say it's very well rounded, but it's very articulate. Kind of reminds me in many ways of my Nakamichi, my CR3A. The mid-range is very open, very detailed. I wouldn't exactly call that also very rich, but it does give a lot of information. The highs are very smooth, very easygoing, and very well extended. You get a good sense of air in this machine. The only thing I would say about this machine is that you don't get a lot of body in the music. And depending upon what you listen to, if you listen to a lot of classical, if you listen to very simple straight ahead jazz, small ensemble, you'll probably do very well. If you listen to a lot of rock and roll, you might want a little bit more fullness. But overall, I gotta say, relative to all the music I listen to, I really do enjoy the AD-F660 as a whole, given its limitations. And it doesn't have a lot. I don't want anybody to think that this deck sounds bad. It doesn't. It does have the well-deserved moniker of the Miracle deck. There are a lot of other publications that review it, and I think they're pretty spot on. And I think it's a machine that everybody can really enjoy. So really at the ultimate end of the day, without sounding like the rest of the YouTube hyperbole and metaphor factory here, gotta say, if you have a chance to get one of these decks, doggone it, I would. And that all being said, let's move on to the final thoughts. Here are my final thoughts, and maybe perhaps at the same time, who is this machine for? Okay. Well, the easy part is who this machine is for. I would say everybody. Anybody who's curious about seeing and hearing the cassette mystique. This is a good machine to start with, and I quite frankly will say end with. I really do enjoy using this machine. It's very easy to use. It's not too overwhelming. You don't have a lot of computerized calibration functions. You don't have to worry about azimuth. You don't have to worry about anything that's really exotic. It's a very straightforward, very easy machine to use. It's got a very distinctive look. That's another thing that's great about it. It's not another black box like the millions of ones that I have here. You actually have contrast. You got the black on the silver look, which I think is very attractive. It definitely screams the 1980s, and I don't think that's a bad thing. The 1980s for me were a very fun time, and I very much enjoyed being in those times. And I think the Aiwa brings a lot of those good times back. Playing just about any tape through it, I don't have any problems with it. It just plays any cassette that I put into it. Some of them that are very, very old, some of the original XL2s, some of the old TDK-Ds. It plays them just fine. Some of my other machines, sometimes I get a little cranky handling some of my tapes. There could be those machines just might need a little bit more love in the transport, so I have to give them a fair shake once that happens. But out of the box, I couldn't be happier, really. I got this off of eBay used. It was about $350, and I think it's a fair price for this guy, around $300 something, or even maybe a little bit less. But I think it's a fair price. You get 3 heads for confidence monitoring. You get a transport that's very solid. You get a very detailed sound. You got the Dolby B and the C noise reduction, which is how most tapes are going to be made. Very, very few people even know what DBX is, for example, or Hi-Com or DNR, which was also back in the day a kind of noise reduction you could use. But Dolby B and Dolby C is the most common. And if you're going to probably trade tapes, more likely than not, Dolby B or Dolby C was probably used in your friend's tapes or family's tapes. So I would say this is one of my top recommendations. I really like this machine. I really enjoy using it. And I think if you're looking at a cassette deck that gives you a lot, I think you could do a lot worse than this guy. This is a very strong contender, and I think it represents the 1980s very well. Now, I was no longer a company. I was gone. Sony had absorbed them and basically liquidated everything. It's completely gone. So how's it going to be as far as getting parts and spares, if you will? I think it's going to be about average to a little bit less than average as far as the difficulty is concerned. Things like belts you can still get. That's pretty easy to do. Things like head stacks, the controller boards, panel meter, and so on, that might start to get difficult because, after a while, these machines will just kind of exhaust the supply. There are only so many of them made, and this is the 1980s that this machine was made. So I would say if you do have one of these, it's a treasure that, is it going to last forever? I don't know. I would say if you follow good best practices, replace the electrolytic capacitors if you can. Some folks like to use on the lower values film capacitors because they just sound better. I leave that up to you. I will recap this machine at some point. I'll probably put in Nishikon audiophile grade 105 centigrade electrolytics in this. Probably be good for another 20-30 years with this guy. Do keep an eye on the belts though. They will turn into what I affectionately call goo. okay, or saltwater taffy. And that's no fun to clean. I had to do more than my fair share of these. The wiring, as you look inside this cassette deck, that might scare you a little bit, but don't let it. Just proceed slowly. You can still get the service manual for these, if I remember correctly. Hop on to hifiengine.com to get the documentation. I can't exactly remember if you get the service manual. I could be wrong, but I get a lot of my documentation from Hi-Fi Engine, and it's absolutely free. That's the thing that's really nice. You have a lot of folks compiling and putting these up there on the site. It's a great site to get owner's manuals, brochures, and your service documentation. So that all being said, support is going to be average to, I think, poor than average. It's not going to be like a TIAC or something like that. Or a Nakamichi even. But even those machines are getting harder and harder as time goes on to get the spares. So if you have an opportunity to look around and kind of keep your ears open and eyes open as far as what the vulnerabilities are for your tape machine, hopping on eBay and grabbing a few spares and keeping them just in case, probably not a bad idea. Your common wear parts, pinch rollers, belts, are going to be something you're going to want. Electrolytic capacitors, as far as I'm concerned, that's also a common wear part. They're not going to last forever. Nothing does. But those kinds of things there are your common parts. There, your heads. These heads look like they're brand new. I don't know how much this guy used this machine, but that they had it before me. But they look practically brand new. So with reasonable care, the head should last a lifetime. So keep them clean. This machine has an automatic demagnetize feature I failed to mention earlier. Whether or not that's really happening, I don't know. I just, as a matter of course, demagnetize all the metal parts in the tape path anyway. That's just a habit that I've had ever since I was a kid. So, you can never over-maintenance something. There's no such thing. So with that, I would say an unequivocal recommended, definitely. And especially for somebody who's wanting to get one deck or maybe add a deck to their collection. I think the 660 and the 770 and, of course, the most difficult to get 990, I would definitely recommend. I think they're every bit as good as a Nakamichi or some of the other machines a lot of people talk about. Some of the Sony ES and so on. I think you get a lot of the Sony in this machine without maybe perhaps some of the hassles they give you. Sony cassette decks, especially ES, tend to be quite a challenge to work on. I almost got a dual well W9 ES, I believe, and after seeing what it takes to bring that thing back alive, I kind of bowed away. But it is still a great cassette deck. If you're looking at a dual deck, you can't beat a W9 ES. It's a great machine. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up, and I want to thank everybody for hanging in with me. I know I've been gassing for a long time, and I do really appreciate you staying with me. But if you see an AD-F650, or 660, excuse me, made a new model number, check it out, especially if a tech has gone through it and the price is reasonable and you want to experiment with a cassette. I think this is a great buy. With that, I leave you right now, and until next time, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye, and I thank you for watching and listening.